Welcome to the Giggle podcast. I'm your host, Sal Grover. This podcast exists for cancelled women to have a voice in an era when most media is ignoring us simply because we stand up for our own rights and know that there is a difference between males and females.
Okay, so can you tell us who you are and what brought you into this gender women's rights arena?
Okay. Well, my name is Bernard Lane. I'm a journalist. I've been a long time newspaper journalist with the Australian newspaper. And back in early 2019, I had a request from my editor to look at some conflict involving the Melbourne Comedy Festival, because their top award is the Barry Award after Barry Humphries. And Barry Humphries had made some remarks, I think in London, about trans children issues. And I think he had used those terms mutilation. And there was a pushback from woke comedians, including, I think, Hannah Gadsby. And my recollection is that the Melbourne Comedy Festival did change the name of the awards. They removed the Barry Humphries reference. And so I had to write about that, and that exposed me a little to trans activists. And then I forget how it happened, but I came across the Jessica Yaniv case in Canada. And for people who haven't heard of it, this was a man who claimed to identify as a woman and approached a number, I think maybe a dozen, beauty salons or waxing clinics, whatever you call them, and didn't approach a big salon where a male staffer could have attended to his needs, but approached mostly small businesses, often, I think some of them were migrant women working at home with small children, and he was asking for a Brazilian wax, and at some point was making it clear that he had intact male genitals. And so, unsurprisingly, the answer was no, you'd have to go somewhere else for that. And so he took a human rights discrimination case to the tribunal in British Columbia. And there was a farcical situation whereby his anonymity was being protected while the human rights commissars were investigating. And a number of those women, the stress of it, their businesses folded. And there was virtually no mainstream media coverage of it. At some point, though, Ricky Gervais tweeted, "It's a terrible state of affairs when a lady can't get her balls waxed." And so it became, it was a huge thing on Twitter, even before there was much media coverage, with the hashtag wax my balls. And so I wrote about that. And then I think I heard that, a star up and coming philosopher was going to be cancelled or deplatformed, or at least there was going to be an attempt at the annual conference of the philosophers in Australia. And so I went and looked at the abstract of the paper that was going to be delivered by this academic, Holly Lawford Smith, political philosopher down at Melbourne University. And it was just very clear to me that that was pretty standard philosophical argument. You could agree with it, you could disagree with it, but there was nothing hateful about it. And it just seemed mind-boggling that she was facing aggressive threats and attempts to deplatform her. And somehow from there, I got into the gender clinic business. I forget how, but I think Holly had told me about the sex-based rights issues, and I didn't really even understand what she was talking about at first. She was talking about, sex-based places. I'm not sure what the terminology was, but it was quite foreign to me. I had no idea that this debate was going on. I had a vague idea that gender clinic medicine happened, but I really didn't know anything about it. And something about it just pushed me away when I heard about it. I wasn't aware that that if you looked into it, you could get cancelled, but it just seemed to me something something a bit marginal, that. But so at some point, though, it's like a series of knock-on events. I think I might have found the writing of Professor of Pediatrics at Western Sydney University, John Whitehall. He'd written a series of articles in Quadrant magazine about the gender medicine, and that, I think, led to some contacts with campaigners who were worried about these treatments. And so I wrote my first article on gender clinics in Australia back in August 2019, quoting John Whitehall, also Diana Kenny, who was a professor of psychology at University of Sydney, and then it really just snowballed from that.
And so now basically you're the one journalist in Australia who's covering this issue, especially sort of the let's say trans kids, quote unquote, issue. Is that correct?
Well, I think that every now and then a journalist has, written one or two articles here or there, but I don't think anyone has written about it in a sustained way or in a detailed way.
Overall, what would you say is the reaction that you're getting to the articles that you're bringing out about what's happening to kids?
The initial reaction when I started writing in August 2019 was a tremendous amount of pushback on social media, including from prominent journalists who were sort of self-appointed activists and defenders of trans kids. And the standard line was that I was attacking trans kids, attacking children's hospitals. The suggestion was made that these kids were uniquely vulnerable and that my writing might push them towards suicide.
All those young kids reading The Australian.
Well, I agree they are vulnerable kids, but
100%. But I wouldn't say it's that many sort of like 9-year-olds reading The Australian newspaper.
Yeah, you're only allowed to talk about their vulnerability if you stick within the gender clinic narrative. If you express concern that those vulnerable kids might be harmed by what the gender clinics are doing, then that's somehow attacking trans kids. But one really striking thing, I think, is that pushback was fierce, and it went on for some days, maybe some weeks. Media Watch joined in. The Guardian wrote some kind of denunciation. Crikey wrote denunciation. And all of them seemed to be implying that my coverage was uniquely harmful and that somehow it had to be stopped. But it didn't stop. I kept going. And all of those people on Twitter just faded away. And so I thought, well, if they were really concerned about my coverage, if they really believed it was so potentially lethal, where are they? So I think it's reasonable for me to conclude that to use one of their favourite words, that their online self-appointed role as defender of trans kids is it's a performance.
I think you've hit on something so big there, because for so many of the pushback that we face in this, it is a performance on Twitter, and it's intense and it's really, really scary, and it can affect your livelihood and mental health and all sorts of things. But those people tend to not be people that are actually doing anything else outside of Twitter pushback. They're not in the real world trying to help or do anything.
Yes. I think that I probably had a smaller ratio of those, kids with blue hair constantly sitting on their computer keyboard. And I had probably a larger number of some of these people are quite big followings, but they faded away. And I did have um, a few things that looked like death threats, and so I wasn't really sure how seriously to take them. I think that now looking back, I don't take them very seriously. But I have a family. I've got school age children, and so I had to take precautions uh, in relation to that.
I've done the same
Um,
thing because when I first started getting death threats, like and it's so me, my initial reaction to them was like delete, 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 because I didn't want to see them. And then I was like, oh, hang on, no, wait, I should have been keeping these. And so I started keeping some of them, but as I've done that more and more, I've become quite desensitized to it. And so now they're kind of water off a duck's back.
yes,
And then you
yeah,
see the repetitive ones as well, and I go like, oh, it comes back to that performance element of it. And while I'm completely against death threats and I'll speak out against them, I'm just at the point where there's been so many.
yes.
I'm like,
And one was from I think she was a lawyer in Melbourne, and she posted the classic image. It was a sort of a gothic Hollywood image of a blood-drenched knife, and and I think I did put. I've ignored most of these, but I just sent her a message saying, are you really intending to send this meeting? And she deleted it. But that person had some kind of education and had some kind of position.
mhm.
Um, and I think you're right that when you get a lot of this abuse and you see how formulaic it is, and as you say, it's a performance not just for my benefit, it's a performance for the people in their tribe.
Yes.
They are earning respect and approval because they are defending trans kids, but it doesn't really seem to amount to much. I mean, there was a very small demonstration outside my office building in Surrey Hills, and rather, and I looked at these people, some of them student age, I suppose, and I couldn't imagine them constituting a threat to anyone. You realise that um, online you can give an impression of this great army of people who have such resolute purpose. But and I recall also that was the case at the philosophy conference when there was a demonstration against Holly, and they were not scary people.
Well, so many of them, and from my experience with it, so many of them actually are just kids. Because say with the Giggle app, they when we'll have these attacks, like, I mean, there's men who try and get on it every day, but sometimes there'll be really big waves of attacks, and there'll be like thousands upon thousands, but they're all taking the onboarding selfie trying to get on. And so we see who they are, and they're just little white teenage boys, and they all have the gamer suits on. And so that's when we always know that there's something going through like Twitch or the gaming, online gaming communities, and they're all just having fun trying to get on. But then they go, the problem is they go then and they write reviews on the App Store and Google Play calling us transphobic and racist, and then media picks up on that and won't, when I explain, look, I can show you exactly where it's coming from, I have the actual evidence and proof here, they won't print that because it's much more of a story to just accuse of racism and transphobia.
Yes.
And so seeing who it's coming from, when I do get to see it, it's not scary at all. It's more annoying than anything. But then the ultimate problem is that the adults in the room are siding with children.
Yes.
And that's what's happening overall, whether it would, like with, say, the online abuse of things, and then the medicalisation of children. It's like children have all the power. This has never happened before.
I think with the gender clinic stuff, there is a pretty substantial group of adults. They're not just clinicians, quite a few of these people are professionals. They identify as being on the progressive left, and they have a superficial understanding. They have the slogans, and they are pretty active on social media as well. I haven't had much social media stuff involving kids.
Okay. So when you
It's
say
hard.
that, like there's like actual clinicians who, and they've got the slogans. I mean, are these the ones who are there treating children and doing affirmation care?
Not necessarily. Some of them are in, say, public health. Some of them would be health bureaucrats. Some of them are in related university disciplines. They're academics. The ideas that underpin gender clinics really come from universities.
And so why do you think all of these people have just decided that there's no such thing as biological sex and it's completely possible to be born in the wrong body? And any opinion to the contrary is harm.
I don't know. I mean, I've seen some of the same commentary that you've no doubt seen, and one argument is that it's an outgrowth of developments in philosophy, postmodern rejection of the idea of objective reality, the focus on language and language policing in the trans area fits within that, because it's this somewhat paranoid idea that words themselves change reality and words themselves can inflict violence and psychic harm. One question mark I have in the back of my head, and I don't really know what the answer is the extent to which certain kinds of feminism had a tendency to play down biological differences because they were seen as obstacles to women attaining status and jobs that were typically monopolised by men. So,
Yeah.
but I don't know that history well enough.
I think it's a valid thing to talk about, because like we've all heard the, like, women can do anything and anything a man can do, and there's no differences and blah, blah, blah. It was a very empowering thing. I suppose that for me, I never took it as literal. You know what I mean? I never went, oh, of course I'm exactly the same as a man, because there's just obvious differences. Mine was just, it was just like, oh, don't give me less because I'm a woman, was always my interpretation of it. So I suppose if anyone did misinterpret it, then my feeling is that the misinterpretation more comes from men now saying this back to us, like, oh, hang on, did feminism have a role in this? And saying this, I'm like, I don't think so. I think it's semantics, but this was before this was happening before this change in language interpretation happened. So it's being looked at under a different lens now than maybe it was before.
Yeah, it is still hard, isn't it, to cast your mind back and think about that period when biology was being played down, and somehow work out how you get from that to outright denial of biology and statements such as trans women are women and we're meant to take that as being true in every possible way. I mean, maybe another aspect of it, which goes wider and deeper than the possible role of feminism, is the old nature-nurture debate.
Mm-hmm.
And so progressives generally have leaned towards the nurture side of things, because I guess that's an optimistic view. If you're a progressive, if you see all sorts of social ills and you insist that none of these inequities or differences are hardwired. They are created by society. We talk about social construction these days, and then at least in theory, you can get in there and re-engineer things and re-educate and produce different outcomes towards a more just society.
Yeah, but I suppose my criticism of that is I don't think prior to what we're experiencing now, I don't know anyone who thought that not seeing men as women was a social ill that needed to be overcome. If anything, it was the seeing of women as men that was where the equality was going to be. And that's not happening now because we don't have any trans men who are being viewed as men. Like someone commented on one of my things on Twitter the other day, and it's just so true. Trans men aren't becoming politicians at the rate of trans women. I think there's like one or two somewhere around the place. They're not becoming politicians, CEOs of companies, these sort of heralded as billionaires and these great athletes and breaking records. They're having babies and being praised for it. That nothing has changed in the sexism narrative of the world. It's happening, but even right now, as we're seeing some of these like men with really big platforms come into this, such as like Matt Walsh and Bill Maher, and they're being listened to immediately, and the threats are very different to what, say, J.K. Rowling would get.
Yes.
And so the sexism is being played out there in the exact same way it's being played out in the actual trans narrative. So it's fact, you can just see it.
If you think about gender clinics and think about the prominent clinicians, quite a number of them are women. What do you make of that? Because if you listen to the gender critical feminists, they will say, this is patriarchy enacted in a different way. But if you look at the particular issue of the medicalising of gender non-conforming kids, then women are quite prominent and occupy leadership positions.
So
I
have only theories of this. And part of my theory stems from the fact that I talked to a teacher about it. She was a retired teacher. And she said, in a way, like this behavior of mothers transing their children now is nothing new. If you understand that Munchausen's by proxy has always actually existed and been there. It's where the ADD, like when everyone was saying their kids had ADD, when everyone was saying their kids had autism. There's a lot of mothers specifically, for whatever reason, I don't know all of that, but this was just for whatever reason, it's not unusual for mothers to sort of want to make their kids special in this way. It's just this one is kind of the most dangerous because of the extreme medicalization of it, because it's just, and then it's so detached from reality. And then I've also read about how, like, it seems to be like in parents, there's lots of fathers who are doing this, or male teachers, male doctors, whatever, and there's lots of women doing it, but the reasons are different. It seems that from like a father transing a child potentially is going to come from more of a fear homophobic place, and the mother doing it is coming from more of a Munchausen's place. That's just a theory. So yeah, definitely women aren't, in terms of when you get into the clinical nature of it, obviously women aren't innocent in this. I look at it though as the overriding thing is that none of this would be happening if it wasn't men saying that they are women. If that wasn't taken seriously to begin with, we wouldn't be in this position.
And yet we have the dominant group in gender clinics internationally is teenage girls.
Well, yes,
2/3 or so, and the top gender clinicians are female. I mean, I don't have any theory about this. It's just, it's an interesting fact. I mean, the other element too is that if you look at the groups of parents who are resisting this medicalisation, then women are quite dominant there, as far as I can tell. Every now and then I run across a father in these groups, but they seem to be in the minority.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, if you look at the stories, especially that have come out of Canada, that's where, like, it's been where gender ideology in children and the effects on kids has been so contentious in divorces. And you've had fathers trying to save the kids and mothers trying to trans the kids. Yeah, it's definitely, it's something that definitely shouldn't be ignored, because in terms of this whole thing, which is a battle of the sexes, you've got to take responsibility and accountability for the wrongs of, and take and acknowledge the reality of it. I mean, I do wonder if it's easier to maybe manipulate women's empathy. I don't know if we're allowed to say that, but
In what context?
Because when I think of just my own journey with it, of prior to February 2020, when I had no idea what was going on, I'd never really heard about it, but I'd heard that, there were people who were trans, and I was like, okay, that's cool. And I would never want to deny rights to the LGBTQ plus community. Or any demographic of people, I would never want to deny rights to. And so it got me there of just like, of course, people can be who they want to be. And it was sort of an extension of feminism in that way, because it was like, I'd spent my whole life being like, yes, I can do and be who I want to be. So it really, really grabbed on to that empathy that I had. And then when I started to look into what was happening and it all started to unravel, I felt very, I felt like it was like an abuse of that. It made me feel very angry. And even now, to this day, where sometimes my instinct will be to be kinder to someone who is saying absolute bullshit to me and being cruel, rather than be kind to myself and my own intellectual honesty. So that's why I just wonder if there is a way, if it is that women's empathy is being attacked more, or if it is just people not looking into it, if it is actually not so much intellectual laziness, although I think that it's heading in that direction, because at this point, I think it's becoming so mainstream that if you're ignoring it, it's on purpose. But yeah, but then I also think that if you are a woman and you say you are aware of what's going on and you look out there and you see what happens to the women who speak out against it, I mean, it's just you'd go, okay, it's better for me to just go with it. Yeah.
The attacks on women online seem to be, disproportionately nasty.
But even in the real world, because if you look to the likes of Jasmine Sussex, who was with the Australian Breastfeeding Association, simply speaking out about it, she has lost, it's basically almost 20 years of her work that she's dedicated to this organization. And now it's gone, and her reputation has been affected by it. And so something she dearly loved and was passionate about is taken from her. So what, that's why, I always ask people, I'm like, what is your advice to women? Do you say speak up, or do you say, keep going how you're going? And everyone says speak up, and I agree, everyone should speak up. But I do understand why there's a lot of women out there saying, you know what, I can't afford to, whether it's financially or mentally or emotionally, they cannot afford to speak up. And I have empathy for that.
Yeah.
So, but at the same time, I can't make excuses for anyone who is actually performing any procedure on a child.
I guess it depends what you mean by excuses, but I think, my own assumption is that unless there's good evidence that someone is acting in bad faith, or has deliberately or recklessly ignored the risks, then it's reasonable to operate on the basis that they genuinely believe that these treatments are beneficial.
Do you think there's actually that there are actual doctors working and clinicians just in general who actually think there are children who are born in the wrong body?
Well, it's interesting that expression "born in the wrong body," it's much less used now. But I think that if you take the suddenly dominant treatment model for these kids, the gender affirming model, I think that the high-profile clinicians associated with that model are true believers. They are zealots, and they really do believe that they are locked in, kind of a Manichaean struggle with the forces of transphobia and hatred and bigotry. Joanna Olson Kennedy, who runs I think it's still the biggest gender clinic in the US at the LA Children's Hospital. She was out here at the weekend for the conference of the Australian Professional Association for Transgender Health, AusPath, and she gave a presentation on what's happening in the States. And I think one of the clinicians here tweeted that this was a terrifying prospect. There's quite a number of Republican states in the US seeking to prohibit under 18 medical gender change. So, and I don't doubt that the people at that AusPath conference genuinely believe that that this is a terrifying state of affairs. They believe that these kids are at a uniquely high risk of suicide, notwithstanding the fact that the evidence for that is very poor. And they believe that their treatments can reduce that risk. And if you put all of that together, that's a state of mind in which they're very motivated.
But to be honest, it makes me absolutely terrified of even just getting medical care myself in any other context, because I'm like, do doctors seriously not look at all sides of things?
Well, but this is a very special and different area, isn't
it? Totally. But I'm like, but is it? I mean, what if this becomes the norm for everything? That's where my mind goes to it.
But other areas lack the essential elements. So here, if you go back to, say, before the year 2000, over some relatively lengthy period, there was always a very small number of kids who had this extremely strong rejection of their birth sex, and they were overwhelmingly preschool boys, and that wasn't seen as an identity politics issue. It wasn't seen as a question of whether or not you accept their opposite sex identity and validate it or not. And instead, that condition, the name keeps changing, but we now call it gender dysphoria, that was seen as a very real and severe psychiatric condition, which did require compassion and required, in some cases, psychotherapy was used, but there was no talk of medicalisation. Whereas now, it's very hard to get a lot of people to actually focus on what gender clinics are doing. And when I say focus, I mean look carefully at the actual procedures, at the supposed evidence for it, because we've had this relentless campaign now for several years framing this as all about acceptance, identity, and that's been supported by a massive campaign of activism. And so, in a way, when people talk about these issues, they're not really talking about medicine at all. The comment, this ethicist, I haven't written this up yet, but she's very experienced, has an international reputation, And she was asking the rhetorical question, is this actually medicine? So you can look at it as a hybrid. It's identity politics, which has a sort of a medical technology arm to it.
Sorry.
Well,
Sorry, go on.
yeah, so, and it's interesting because I thought you might want to talk about Labor and its attitude
Yes, I do.
to gender clinics.
Yes.
And I had a look at the party platforms, and I think it's the most recent one. The 2021 platform refers to transgender, gender diverse people and their access to healthcare, which sounds fine. Everyone should have access to healthcare.
100%.
And then it refers to, I think it refers to medical technologies is the term. A previous platform talked about gender affirming surgery. But it's interesting, the reference to it as technologies, because it makes it sound like, it's part of the service sector. There are these medical technologies out there, and as a consumer, you're entitled to them. So I think that some of this explains why lots of mainstream people, excuse me, when they have some reason to focus their minds on gender clinics, say, for example, hearing about Catherine Deeves's comments, most people in the mainstream, I think they don't really focus in a factual way on the medical procedures. That's partly the problem, is very poor media coverage. But I think it's also that, especially if you're a progressive person, you were for same-sex marriage, then this sounds like just the next civil rights. And of course, it's being framed that way quite deliberately.
That's my whole point. It's being framed that way.
I can't hear you.
Oh. Can you hear me now? Yep. Sorry.
Yep.
That's my whole point, is that it's being framed as this next civil rights thing, this next LGBT thing. And if that is all you're hearing about it, your instinct as a progressive person, which I've always considered myself to be, you go, yes, cool, then I'm in, tick. But then when you dig scratch under the surface for it, it took me minutes. Because for me, I started seeing, when I looked into it, I so quickly saw the attacks on African and Middle Eastern women who are campaigning to end female genital mutilation. I saw the attacks on them from trans rights activists because they were using terms like female and associating this and the term mutilation, basically. And I was like, how on earth are these worlds even colliding? And so,
well, that's, there's a lot of history to be written here, because that shift whereby the former gay rights bodies seems to have been around 2015, very slightly country to country, but suddenly there were no more gay rights lobbies or gay and lesbian rights bodies. You had this new thing called the LGBT. And again, in Labor's platform, you can see the progress whereby back in, say, 2011, it was LGBTI, I think, and the Q only comes in a more recent platform, the Q with a plus, and a sprinkling of the queer words. So that shift from gay and lesbian to LGBTQ plus happened really without much reporting on it. I don't remember seeing any commentary in the mainstream media about what this meant. And in the minds of most people in Australia, if they're following Australian media coverage, there is this monolithic rainbow community, which is LGBTQI plus, etc. And they all have the same interests, and in the same way that gay liberation triumphed over ignorance and prejudice, trans is now facing that same kind of ignorance and prejudice.
Which is
and all good.
honestly complete and utter bullshit, because you have in Tasmania where lesbians were stopped from organising an event, a female-only lesbian event. So if we're talking about LGBTQ plus rights, there's one group there that's been completely ignored and has no rights.
Yep. And there's the case of Alison Bailey, the barrister in the UK. I'm not sure how many people have heard of that case, but she's a lesbian. She was an early member, I think, of the LGB Alliance, which was set up in.
And well, she worked with Stonewall, the UK organisation. I believe she worked with Stonewall on something.
I didn't know that, but it looks like she was working. Her chambers appear to be rather queer theory woke, and because Alison Bailey was associated with the LGB Alliance, which was seen as transphobic because they pushed away the T and the Q, Stonewall, this is the allegation, that Stonewall applied pressure to punish Alison Bailey. I think the hearing is going on at the moment. And the rise of the LGB Alliance is a very interesting story in itself, which I don't think has been covered in any kind of detail anywhere. It's quite remarkable.
I mean, but especially here in Australia, because one of my things, and this, like, to keep it into this politics realm as well, and we're on the Monday after an election and we have a new government, and there's lots of ways I'm all for a Labor government, but this is the one issue where I'm like, I'm really scared about it, because I don't want the word woman to be completely redefined in legislation. I don't want the Sex Discrimination Act to be even butchered even more than it already is. I want it to actually be fixed, because it has this very muddled gender identity clause in it now that really confuses the whole damn thing. And I want lesbians to be able to, I want women to be able to congregate without men, but very much so, if I'm talking specifically about LGBTQ plus rights, I want lesbians to have rights as well. Because at the moment, it seems there's only one letter in there that's getting the focus and the media attention. And so these people who say, you've got to be inclusive, and these are the most marginalized people in society, you're marginalizing the other groups by ignoring them. So, yes. And in Australia, I just feel, one of the things I say to people all the time is that we don't have the right here to pretend to be ignorant on the issue, especially the media doesn't, because this has been going on in the UK for years and in Canada for years. We've got so much evidence and data that those countries didn't have. And the UK England specifically, has handled this pretty well overall. And we could go in that direction. I think the reason why they've actually handled it pretty well is because they have a media that will actually report on lots of different issues. Whereas in Canada, it hasn't gone well at all. And my fear is Australia is heading in that direction.
Yes.
Where everything's being done in stealth.
Sorry, what did you say?
That everything is being done in stealth. That these laws are being changed, and the new definitions in legislation, and it bothers. One of the reasons why it bothers me so much is that same-sex marriage had to go through a plebiscite to get approved. It was offensive how much it had to go through to get accepted in Australian law. But taking away women's rights, or this concept of like these single-sex spaces or single-sex sport, and just language in general, it's just being just happening without people's knowledge. I just don't know how you can.
I think our institutions are more shallow. I think it's easier to capture our institutions, and I think that despite the myth of the rugged individualistic Aussie, I think Australians have a strong streak of conformism, and the media are prone to herd behaviour, and journalists generally all around the Western world they see themselves as somewhat left of centre, somewhat progressive. And so the media herd seems to have swallowed this idea that trans rights are progressive. But they don't really write about it very much, except when someone like Catherine Deves pops up and says something that doesn't conform to the script.
One of my theories with that, because it's Samantha Maiden at news.com.au who basically brought Kath to the mainstream, because she just started reporting on her tweets, just did article after article with it. And there's a part of me that goes like, is she actually on Kath's side and she wanted this to be brought out in the mainstream and she knew the best way to do it was to actually write as if she was against Kath? You know do you get what I'm sort of saying with it?
Yeah,
Is it a strategy?
I think that really just that's really just testament to the kind of mindset that you can get when you spend too much time following these issues, because you start to see so-called serious reporting and you think that is so ridiculously one-sided, it's got to be satirical, on some kind of issue. But there was one very funny, some people won't find it funny, but there was the issue of a surfer in WA who had won in the men's event and then identified as female and won in the female event. And
this is the one kind of last week.
Yeah, there's a surfing magazine.
Yeah.
There's a surfing magazine. It's an online magazine, and whoever wrote it, it's written this real gonzo journalism style. It was something like LGBTQIA plus community is jubilant as first trans surfer destroys the female opposition in a one-sided contest, and I thought, what? What was the view of the person who wrote this? Are they jubilant themselves, or are they rather suggesting that it's a bit odd to be jubilant about the destruction of the female candidates?
And we're taking it seriously because it is so bizarre. Yeah. Sometimes I don't know.
Yeah. And as for Sam Maiden, I think that she is she's like a news-breaking machine, and she has antennae for stories that will generate a lot of interest. And I think that she has just assumed, presumably because she's living in a certain social and political bubble, she's just assumed that if you quote someone as saying that children are being mutilated and sterilised, that the readers will react to the story on the basis that one should be horrified about that language, but not go further and think about what's involved in those procedures. And it may well be that because this is a subject that a lot of people won't be honest about, they can't, or they feel they can't be honest about, it may well be that quite a number of people seeing those stories might have thought the language a bit strong, but what lasts is a troubling sense of curiosity. Like, what are they actually doing?
That's my point. That's
look into it.
That's why I wonder if some of these journalists who are putting it out there, but seemingly on the side of the activists, to save themselves from abuse, because they just get pushback from the likes of us, but we're not that cruel about it. We just add to the story basically and help them out by going, oh, here's some more evidence and like some facts and things like that. So we bombard them with research, with anything, not death threats.
Yeah, well, there was one story, I'm not sure if it was Sam Maiden, I think it may have been, but the essence of the story was that shock horror, Catherine Deves has claimed that there's a link between autism and trans kids.
Yeah.
And the way the story is written, it looked like the author had assumed that this was just such an obviously deranged thing to suggest. It was so obviously wrong and wrong-headed that that's what made it a story. But of course, the link between autism and kids with gender dysphoria is very well established. And there's quite a number of different interpretations you can make about that.
Yeah, and two things on that, because this is my thing. One, you don't have, the Australian media doesn't have the right to play ignorant on that. A quick Google search will give you articles from all over the UK and the US about this.
Yeah,
that you can quote. I mean,
well, and I've reported on it multiple times, but I suppose
this was my next thing, is that when you report on it, you don't have the luxury of being ignorant. You have to have so many facts and back them up and check them to make sure that you are saying the correct thing. But somebody else can just, the other side can just throw it out there and be sensational about it.
Yeah, that's true. There's a kind of a double standard. So, for example, you probably recall the Lisa Littman study about this idea of rapid onset gender dysphoria. So when she published that, by the standards of research in that area, it was a cautious and reasonable study. But because it came up with a possible conclusion that contradicts the trans narrative, the activist response, including from academics, there's two steps to it. One was to misrepresent what she was actually arguing. And the second step was to demand the highest possible methodological standards. And yet these same trans activists, and in some cases clinicians, will take a study which in its design is much weaker and more open to criticism than the Lisa Littman study, but they will promote that study relentlessly, and the media will accept it without quibble because it produces a result that fits with the trans narrative.
I read about this, there's something called like knowledge laundering or something, and it's happening like sociology departments where they're just peer reviewing themselves essentially and re-quoting themselves because it affirms what the ideology of it. And so then suddenly you've got peer review papers on
it. Well, yeah, I mean, it might be that peer review is like democracy, it's a terrible system, but all the other systems are even worse because I think that peer review, when you're dealing with a hot button topic that is shot through with identity politics and where sign of dissent from the standard narrative can cost you your livelihood, your job, your reputation, then peer review may not be very good at knocking out bad studies. But I mean, what you say is true. There's a tremendous double standard that journalists will feel free to state as fact things for which there is no good evidence, or where there's a lot of disagreement. I mean, I saw a report recently in a US media outlet which was about disagreement over gender clinics, and in this passing remark, the journalist just wrote, of course, there was no controversy over the use of puberty blockers. So the journalist was admitting that there was controversy in some other area. I've forgotten what it was. It might have been cross-sex hormones, but that was just stated as a fact beyond dispute. Whereas if someone says that it's a matter of concern that so many of the kids in gender clinics have autistic features or are, potentially undiagnosed autistic kids, then the scrutiny that is applied to that will be very severe.
I liken it to if you like think of the movie Spotlight, where they did it was the expose on the Catholic Church and the abuse, that being the first big thing to come out. It's basically when that came out, everyone accused them of blasphemy and it was dismissed and and put in a drawer, and no one was allowed to talk about it. That's basically what this is happening now with kids. We're reporting what's happening with kids.
Yeah, I don't see. I don't really know what is happening now. I remember when in mid 2019, once I had talked a fair bit to contacts here in Australia, and I had looked at the reporting in the UK, and it just seemed pretty clear that there were all you had to say was that there are serious questions being raised about these gender clinic treatments and whether or not they help or harm, and whether or not informed consent is possible, and are they ethical? And once I had realised that that was the situation, that no reasonable person who had looked at it could really deny that there were legitimate questions that needed to be looked at. And so I thought that once I had reported a reasonable amount of this in Australia, that it would produce a pretty swift and serious response. And the truth is, it hasn't really. I mean, Greg Hunt appeared to be concerned and sent the matter off to the Royal Australian College of Physicians, and they had a kind of a review, but it turned out that they had a conflict of interest because they had been promoting exactly these treatments previously.
Let's get to what we've had with like the Australian Human Rights Commission, who claim that Giggle is it's gender identity discrimination, and it's like, but you guys created that law, or that clause in the legislation. So are you? Of course, you're not on our side with this. Huge conflict.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I mean, again, any reasonable onlooker who does a bit of reading and research about the role of the Human Rights Commission in promoting this concept of gender identity at odds with biological sex and helping to bring about a change in the law under the Gillard government in 2013, which I don't think the coalition opposed. I'd like to check that. But in any event, the Human Rights Commission is, I would have thought, completely conflicted.
Good thing. I mean, whether they're held to account for it, and who's going to hold them to account.
Well, exactly, yeah. But you look at the title of, they have a sex discrimination commissioner, and they have an act called the Sex Discrimination Act. They don't have a gender identity commissioner, although again, that was in the 2018 platform that Bill Shorten took to the election. One of their promises was to set up a LGBTIQ plus two-spirit, etc. Commissioner.
And then, one of the new Labor government, in the first 5 things that Prime Minister Albanese wants to do is sort of this revamp on government institutions. So I'm assuming that that's all part of it. They haven't detailed it, but I'm assuming that's on the list.
Well, there's kind of, if you look at the changes over the years in the party platform, there's mixed messages. The Shorten platform was promising that Labor, wherever possible, would reduce out-of-pocket costs for gender-affirming surgery. In the current platform, the 2021 platform, that disappeared. The Shorten platform was promising the Sexual Orientation Gender Identity Commissioner. So, that's the new queer theory formula. A commissioner, full-time commissioner, would be appointed alongside this Sex Discrimination Commissioner, presumably. That disappeared in the 2021 platform. And Albanese was on the record as saying that Labor took just too many policies to the election and people were confused, and he cut back some of that LGBTIQ stuff. and the gay press were very unhappy about it.
Hmm.
But they still do have in their talk about strengthening the law to stop vilification, harassment, of transgender people, and depending on what that means, that could make free
That's the
speech
thing.
even more difficult.
That's the thing. What does that mean? Because all people are against all good people are against the vilification of another person. I don't want somebody else to have to experience that kind of behavior. But you can't then say having female-only spaces or female-only sport is vilifying a trans person, because then you're vilifying women. And then you can't deny that there's a rights conflict here that we have to be able to look at, and that there are really obvious solutions to it. But one of the things I wanted to ask is in Australia, is there any sort of universal records on how many kids are on puberty blockers?
No. That was one of the first things I tried to find out. So I went to the Federal Health Department. They had no records. One reason for that may be that puberty blockers are used off-label, meaning that they were approved for other purposes. They've never been approved for gender dysphoria. Those hormone suppression drugs were used with kids who have precocious puberty. It's a very different use because those kids go into puberty very early on, and that could cause some serious problems, including social, psychological, and I think also medical problems. And so they're held back. I mean, the hormone suppression is given until they reach the age at which their cohort should be going into puberty. So no records on puberty blocker use nationally. I also went to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. I think that's the name of the outfit. Yeah. So they didn't have any records for gender medicine because it's not classified that way. So the surgeries, for example, mastectomies, there's no medical benefit scheme, or there's no classification within our the medical subsidy system for those specific operation transgender mastectomy. There's just mastectomies. So the only data that's been available is data that's been secured from the big children's hospital gender clinics by Freedom of Information request. And that data is very basic, sometimes contradictory. And one of the few things that did emerge from Greg Hunt's intervention was that he announced that he would put pressure on the states to do various things. And one of those things was to come up with a nationally consistent framework for data collection. And it seems pretty clear that they did have an initial process through a federal state health bureaucracy body. And it did emerge that data collection was very patchy. And this has been the situation with gender clinics all around the world, that the data collection is poor. So
and in that sense,
we can show.
Do we have to then rely on basically the kids growing up and detransitioning to?
No. You dropped out a bit there. Did you ask about data on detransition in Australia?
No, I'm just saying, do we, because we just don't know the numbers here, do we have to just wait until these kids start to detransition to get an idea of what's going on?
I guess so, but knowing, let's say that some detransitioner groups emerge in Australia, I suppose you might be able to work backwards and assume a certain percentage detransition, and then you might be able to work out how much has been going on. But getting a full picture is going to be very difficult because I haven't focused much on data from Tasmania, South Australia, Northern Territory in the public system. So we've published some data from the three big children's hospital gender clinics, which are Royal Children's Hospital Melbourne, Queensland Children's Hospital in Brisbane, and Perth Children's Hospital. They're the ones with substantial caseloads and very rapid increases in patient numbers. But of course, not all those kids get medical treatments. And so the data on how many are getting medical treatments it's more patchy.
Is there any more data on, like, say...
You're dropping out there, Sal.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me again now?
Yep.
Okay. Is there any data on adults, so 18 plus? Because, for example, when I talked to Judith Hunter, who, her daughter had transitioned and is now detransitioned, and she announced that she was a boy when she was 17, and so it was family conflict. Then day she turned 18, off she could go off and do this on her own. They had nothing to do with it. So is there just suddenly this rise of 18-year-olds getting hold of these cross-sex hormones?
Yeah. Again, there's no good data. I've got some data, but that's something that needs more work. And it is an important issue because we know that I think most people would know that the brain is still developing in adolescence, and that process of development and maturation of the brain is not complete until around the age of 25. I think with men it takes even a bit longer. And this group of young adults, often with serious mental health problems, that's an emerging concern. Most of the media coverage of gender clinics focuses on under 18s because of the legal threshold. But GenSpect, for example, which is that international group of representing parents of many kids who are caught up in this, quite a number of those kids are in their early 20s. And there's just much less debate about this. Legally, they're entitled to do it, but often they crash and burn, and it's the parents who have to try to pick up the pieces. And I know that at least one state in the US, one of the Republican states, which is looking at restricting under 18 medical transition, in the debate, this issue was raised about kids, young adults whose brains are not yet mature, but who would not be covered by this new restriction of access to pediatric transition.
So, okay, because we're just sort of running out of time. So how I want to sort of end it is, where do you see this all going in Australia? Are you optimistic? And please say you are. I hate it when
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. Initially, I think I was naively optimistic. I thought that there would be a pretty rapid response, and it didn't happen. Well, actually, I shouldn't say that. I mean, I think there's a couple of reasons for optimism. One is the change of position by the College of Psychiatrists, the Royal Australian New Zealand College of Psychiatrists. So when I started reporting, they explicitly endorsed the gender affirming treatment guideline issued by the Royal Children's Hospital. That guideline sort of spearheads, if you like, the gender affirming model in Australia, and was used by may still be used by a number of the big children's hospital gender clinics. So the psychiatrists had a mental health policy, LGBT, etc., for youth, and they just had a one-line endorsement in there of that treatment guideline. And after I had reported some concerns about that guideline, and some psychiatrists behind the scenes were making their own inquiries, the College of Psychiatry just quietly cut that specific reference to the Royal Children's Hospital guideline from their policy. And when I found out about that, I rang them up and they said that they were going to do a review. And that dragged on for 2 years. And I think that some people had pretty low expectations and thought that the process would be captured by activists. But in fact, the college came out with a new policy. Trying to think when this was now. It would have been last year, I guess. And that new policy points out the paucity, is the word they use, the paucity of good evidence in this area, the fact that there's expert and professional disagreement. So it's by no means affirmation only. And the college refused to endorse any one guideline. So that's been picked up internationally.
Mhm.
So that is probably the clearest example so far of a medical organisation shifting. Of course, that hasn't stopped what's going on in the gender clinics.
No, but
At least there's
it is very promising in the sense that when it is being reported here that there is no conflict or blah blah blah, it's sort of going, well, actually look at this, because there is.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm.
It's a document you can point people to. But I think the Herald, the Sydney Morning Herald in Sydney, did pick up on this shift. And once one medical organisation, which had previously been gung ho on gender affirmation, once one of those organisations has shifted, then it makes the other organisations uneasy. And so I think that there may well be some further shifts. So I guess that's a reason for optimism. But I just try to stop asking myself that question, because I think it's just better to get on with things, because you can't predict.
I do the same thing. I just go, is this just the new normal and we have to wade through it and explore it and survive in it? But I hope not. I hope that there is a return to, I don't know, freedom of expression and thought would be nice, if nothing else. I'm so tired of people being so punished for having opposing thoughts.
Yeah, it's I have contradictory impulses about this. On the one hand, I think
Sorry.
yeah, so there's plenty of reason for pessimism if you want to look for it. But maybe I have perhaps naive belief that excuse me, even when you look at the arguments of trans activists, which are often very poor arguments, it's still based on the idea that there is a correct view out there. And I think trans activists, and many of the trans activists are not trans, by the way,
Yes.
but the trans activists have an ability to avoid, awkward evidence that is quite remarkable. But I think that in the end, it's going to be difficult for the great mass of people to ignore what's happening in the rest of the world. I mean, if you only took one example, it would be the shift in Sweden, where that very prestigious hospital associated with the Karolinska Institute, which awards the Nobel Prizes, decided that they're not going to give these hormonal and surgical treatments to kids under 18 as routine treatment anymore.
Thank you so much for listening. Please don't forget to share this podcast in all the usual places, as it's so important that we not only celebrate women's voices, but ensure that they're heard. For questions and episode suggestions, please post and comment on Giggle Talk using the hashtag title Giggle Podcast. All episodes are brought to you by the Giggle app, a female-only social networking app where women all around the world can connect to have a voice in a male-free environment, or to find roommates, give and get freelance work, lesbian dating, professional networking, and much, much more. Find it on the App Store and Google Play. Just search Giggle.